you see that?
My
I'm
powers
amazing.
grow yet greater.
A lot has changed in the past few decades for video games, but one thing that has remained constant is that when Square releases a new RPG, it's an event. And in that sense, Square Enix's Bravely Default 2 on Nintendo Switch lives up to the expectations. It is a meaty, high-quality role-playing experience with an intricate combat system that will keep you hooked for dozens of hours. However, like the original Bravely Default, the narrative is still pretty weak overall, which will likely disappoint the Square faithful who are used to better storytelling. The narrative in Bravely Default 2 follows an extremely familiar premise. 4 heroes of light are drawn together by fate to collect 4 elemental crystals and save the world from a villainous empire. There are a couple cool little twists and shockingly dark moments in the middle of the game, and the narrative actually continues well beyond the so-called final battle, but most of the story is extremely predictable. Likewise, almost all of the characters are stock characters you've seen in other games, including the protagonists themselves. The heroes are at least likable, but it's a bit disappointing that they remain so generic across 50+ hours of dialogue and adventuring. Incidentally, it's actually the job system in Bravely Default 2 that sabotages its storytelling. The game makes use of asterisks, magical objects that prescribe a job to your characters and change their appearance accordingly. However, you obtain these from fighting and taking them from other people. That means you know with absolute certainty every time a person with a cool outfit appears on screen, you will definitely beat that person up at some point, even if it's ostensibly a good guy. Story boss fights are almost exclusively against humans wielding these asterisks, so the entire story revolves around contriving boss fights, and it feels really dull and unnatural most of the time. The actual presentation of Bravely Default 2 fares a little better than the story. For starters, the soundtrack is outstanding, constantly capturing the mood while always being catchy. It is certainly a strong early candidate for Soundtrack of the Year for 2020. Additionally, all the towns in Bravely Default 2 are beautiful like in past games, hand-drawn in meticulous detail. However, the rest of the visuals vary in quality. Sometimes the character models have great little details, and sometimes they don't look much better than 3DS models. There are gorgeous ice caverns and attractive forests, and then there are some locales that just feel a bit generic. The animations also feel a bit simplistic, even the monsters are recycled with color swaps all too often, and the performance during these moments isn't great either. The game will actually outright pause for a couple of seconds while it loads dialogue scenes even when the Switch is docked. The stuttering is frequent enough to be a bit annoying, and load times between areas isn't great. In short, the game is not a technical marvel by any stretch. But ultimately, none of that bothered me much, because the battle system is the main draw of Bravely Default 2, and it is fantastic. The Bravely Default battle system fans know returns, with some tweaks. In battle, all characters and enemies have brave points. They can be accumulated through ability effects or through defending with the default command. Brave points are required to act, but you can spend it all at once or even operate at a deficit in order to act upward of 4 times at once with one character. Judging risk versus reward is a massive part of the game, deciding when to bide your time or go all in for a massive attack. However, in Bravely Default 2, rather than having set rounds of combat where everyone acts, the flow of action is continuous. It's not like Final Fantasy's active time battle system, where enemies will attack without waiting for you, but rather like Grandia, where there is an ongoing timeline of action. But unlike Grandia, the game never outright tells you who will act next. There are meters to show how close your characters are to being able to act, but monsters only get a vague exclamation point system over their bodies when they are planning to attack. Knowing vaguely but not precisely when monsters will attack adds a unique additional layer of strategy to the risk and reward gameplay. Spicing up combat further in Bravely Default 2 is the aforementioned job system, and asterisks, which is a really hard word to keep saying. Each job has its own stats, unique abilities, and weapon proficiencies. Most jobs fall into clear, albeit unstated categories like tanking, physical offense, or support. Yet each job feels distinct and offers abilities that might pair extremely well with abilities from another class. You can equip a main job and a sub-job, where only the main job dictates your stats and receives job points to level up. but you can use any skills you've learned in the sub-job during the battle or in the field. For instance, by some point in Chapter 2, I had built a character who could instantly kill everyone on screen at the start of the battle, which was extraordinary because most battles till then required some type of deliberate strategy. I had to provide a similar build to a second character later on to maintain the strategy, but what it ultimately meant is that I effortlessly steamrolled every normal enemy encounter in the game for dozens of hours. I saved literally hours of time with this strategy, because dungeons are frequent, surprisingly large and maze-like, and feature tons of enemies roaming around on screen. The game does value your time though. You can run around maps at high speeds and crank up the speed of the battle animations to a blistering pace. But on one hand, I could complain that Bravely Default 2 has so many battles that would require so much time to win if I hadn't used this cheap strategy to sidestep it all. But on the other hand, it was my decision to use the strategy, and mindlessly slaughtering everyone in my path was its own kind of fun. And all those fast battles helped me grind for the boss fights, which are the game's ultimate test. Most bosses in the game feel unique because almost all of them are using powers of a distinct asterisk. If you don't understand the game's mechanics, you will die. However, Bravely Default 2 eases you into its difficulty. Powerful support NPCs will help you during the prologue and early chapters, and on rare occasion, they even become a surprisingly integral part of strategy. Curiously though, I found bosses in the early chapters of the game to be the most difficult, perhaps because my options were more limited and the bosses completely shrug off certain types of attacks. There was one boss battle where at a point I just stared at the screen and thought, well, now what? But the game becomes much more manageable as it goes, often even easy, in my opinion. Ultimately, the greatest danger in Bravely Default 2 comes from the enemy's counter abilities. Some enemies and bosses have a chance of automatically activating a counter to specific types of character actions, like attacking or even just defending or healing. The enemy counters are always a scary wild card that you must figure out yourself on the fly, and they might change as the boss fight progresses. It's tense and exciting, but also becomes outright cheap in a few instances, especially against the true final boss, which regularly wipes all of your MP to 0. Square Enix had no chill designing that fight. In Bravely Default 2, you either break the battle system with a beautiful strategy, or it breaks you. And that's the thrill of it. Taking charge of massive customization options to build a party that can uniquely demolish the varied bosses is incredibly satisfying and never gets old. When you couple that stellar action with a phenomenal soundtrack, it becomes possible to forgive the game's uninspired story and technical hiccups. And while I really wish Square Enix were not struggling so much to tell a great story lately, Bravely Default 2 is still an utterly addicting RPG and an excellent addition to the Nintendo Switch library. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up. If you didn't, hit that thumbs down. And if you want to see more early reviews and previews on Nintendo Switch games, as well as some reactions and skits, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will talk to you guys later. See ya.
Be healed.